at the end of this presentation. So next slide. So I will start with some background info. So for people that don't know this, sewage from the homes in Bayshore Village is pumped to the Bayshore Village Sewage Works, which are at Side Road 20 and the 8th concession. And the sewage is treated in 2 stabilization ponds, which we refer to as lagoons. The first lagoon cell is where the treatment occurs. And the second cell is larger because that's where the effluent is stored for the 6 months, during which time over the winter until we can apply it to the land. The performance of these lagoons is monitored, and the data shows that the incoming sewage is treated to the level expected and required. So from mid-May to mid-September, and some years to mid-October, or to the end of October rather, the effluent that's been stored in the large lagoon is pumped to the spray irrigation heads on the township's 2 fields, the south field, which is beside the lagoons, and then the north fields, which is on the other side of the 20th side road. So the spray irrigation system is intended to spread the treated effluent over the land so that some of it evaporates and some of it infiltrates into the ground, where it's utilized by the plants that grow on that field. Next slide. So the goal of the Class A study has been to find the best way to improve how the lagoon effluent is disposed of. The problem, generally speaking, is that the lagoon effluent has been spray irrigated over these fields since the 1980s. And the soils in these fields are clay and silts, and they've become compacted over time. And so they appear to have reduced absorption capacity. And another problem is that the system was not designed with any spare capacity. So the township could not take a field out of service to till it or aerate it to try to bring its capacity back. And now, in recent years, the township operators have found it increasingly difficult to dispose of the entire volume of effluent over the spray irrigation season at the allowed maximum spray irrigation rate. So as background, the system was designed to spray over 100 days over the summer between May and September. And in the past 10 years on average, they were able to spray only 65 days, mostly because of the weather. The system was designed on the basis that it would be less rain than has been in the past 10 years. So there has been change over time of the soil, of the weather. And so the bottom line is right now, the spray irrigation system does not have enough capacity to handle the volume of effluent that is produced every year. I expect some of you know that Ministry of the Environment has asked the township to implement their contingency plan this year. And so a significant volume of effluent from the lagoon had to be hauled to the Lagoon City Sewage Treatment Plant at a fairly high cost. And another significant factor is that there's residents that are very close to the spray irrigation field, and they have indicated that they've observed runoff from the spray field to their property, and they're very concerned about the potential environmental and human impacts. So this is the problem that we're working with, that we're trying to resolve. Next slide. So the Class CA aims to find a solution that, one, provides the required effluent disposal capacity without runoff. That means that we can dispose of the annual volume at the rated capacity of the Bayshore Village Sewage Works, which is 399 meter cube a day, for your information. And preferably that the solution provides some spare capacity to give operations some operational flexibility. It's got to involve a reasonable level of effort to operate and maintain. It has to have reasonable project costs, obviously. It's got to address the residents, the adjacent residents' concerns who are directly affected. And the Ministry of the Environment has to agree that the solution adequately protects the environment. In other words, we have to identify a solution that we know the Ministry of the Environment will give us approval for. So next slide. So I will just go briefly because this project has some history. A Class A study report on this project was issued back in 2017. And at the time, the report identified two solutions. One in the short term, in the immediate, to deal with the urgent need for spare capacity, was to purchase the land that is immediately to the west of the existing lagoons to set up an additional spray irrigation field. And then in the longer term, to abandon spray irrigation altogether and replace it with a tertiary sewage treatment plant that would provide the level of treatment that would allow the effluent to be discharged directly to Lake Simcoe via Wainman Creek. The Ministry of the Environment did not agree with those recommendations. So basically, they said that Class CA could not recommend a solution that's the sewage treatment plant with discharge because the Lake Simcoe protection plan does not allow that to happen. There's no new municipal sewage treatment plant allowed in the Lake Simcoe watershed. And in regards to the spray field, the ministry indicated that further investigation was required. So that's in 2017. Since then, in the following 5 years, the township council went through a lot of effort to present, discuss, argue the value of eliminating spray irrigation and building a tertiary sewage treatment plant to handle the wastewater from Bayshore Village. They did that with ministry senior staff, with politicians, but they had no success. So in the meantime, township staff has worked at reducing the volume of sewage coming from the Bayshore Village sewers. They made significant progress in identifying and addressing the source of extraneous flows into the sewers, such that in the past 2 years, the flows have been down to about 65% of the capacity of the system, which is way better than it was before when it was at and sometimes over the capacity of the system. Anyways, so in 2022, the township resolved to abandon the sewage treatment plant option and asked Tatham to update and finalize the Class CA, which is why we are here now to update this Class CA study. Next slide. So for the Class CA update that we're currently conducting, we reviewed all the alternatives that we had previously considered and added a few. And from a long list of 10 potential alternatives, we screened out 5 of them and kept 5 for further analysis. So our screening criteria were, well, obviously, can it meet the problem statement? Can it meet the current Ministry of the Environment guidelines and policies so that we could get an approval? And does it have the potential to be financially viable? So I'm going to go briefly through the alternatives that were screened out, the 5, and I'll go in more detail in the 5 that we considered further. Next slide. So this slide shows the rationale for screening out 5 of the alternatives. Just briefly, one of them is reducing what we call inflow and infiltration into the sanitary sewers on its own. Just do that. And even though the township has made some good progress, it's not enough. It's not enough to eliminate the issue of capacity at the spray field. So on its own, it's not a viable solution, but it is something that the township will continue and has to continue to do forever, like every other municipality. Another alternative that we screened out was to eliminate the north field, continue spraying with the south field, and replace that with a new west field. And the bottom line is there's just not enough land there to deal with the volume. So we can't just swap one field for the other. So we had to eliminate that option. We considered the option of adding 2 spray fields, one being the west field, and the other one is to finding another piece of property where we could set up spray irrigation. Problem is Bayshore Village is surrounded by wetlands, environmentally protected lands, and you have to go pretty far out, at least 3 to 4 kilometers before you can find land that would potentially be suitable for spray irrigation. So that would mean setting up building a pumping station, building a very long force main, and setting up a spray field. So the costs are very high. So it was screened out on that basis. We also took the time to develop further the option of pumping the effluent from Bayshore Village to the Lagoon City Sewage Treatment Plant. So we've confirmed it was feasible, and we considered 2 routes to do that. One would have been to put a force main along through the wetland along the railway embankment that goes straight to the Lagoon City Sewage Treatment Plant, a distance of about 7 kilometers. The other one would be to stay away from the wetland and stay on the road right-of-ways, which would be 15 kilometers. The capital costs of these options are extremely high. It includes expanding the Lagoon City Sewage Treatment Plant in addition to all of this infrastructure. So it was screened out because of the cost of that. And finally, the option that was originally considered of building a sewage treatment plant and discharging to Lake Simcoe was screened out because we will never get approval for that. So I just wanted to go over those options. Now I'll go over the 5 that we looked a little bit in more detail. So next slide, Ashley. So for comparison, we're doing the option of do nothing. So it's not a viable option to do nothing, but we have to use it for comparison purposes. We always do that in Class CA studies. Because we know that there's not enough land to dispose of the entire volume over the 65 days that has occurred in the past 10 years and at the max rate. And for information at this point, currently, the cost of operating the spray fields, the existing fields, is in the order of $150,000 per year. So that'll come into play when we compare with other alternatives. And the other thing I wanted to mention with do nothing is the cost of hauling sewage that has occurred in 2023 is also very high. So if we were to continue as is, we'd likely to have to continue to haul sewage to the extent that it was hauled this year, which I think it was in the order of $700,000 cost to do that. Okay, next slide. So an alternative we looked at further was to continue with spray irrigation, but continue with the existing south field, the north field, and add the west field. So there'd be 3 fields in operation, which in theory provides enough land for what is needed at the allowed spray rate. But what we would add to that would be disinfect the effluent before it's sprayed by ultraviolet light. And you would add a tree buffer around the edges of the spray irrigation areas. As I think you know, the spray irrigation system was built without any buffers, so they're immediately adjacent to farms on either side. So so the advantage of this option is so we're providing more capacity, so there's less potential for runoff. And some of the adjacent residents' concerns would be addressed with dealing with aerosols and things like that. But on the negative side, there's still the potential that there wouldn't be enough capacity to deal with the effluent volume. Let's say it's a wet and windy summer, and then again, the township would have to rely on this contingency plan and have to haul the sewage at high cost to the Lagoon City plant. The estimated cost of this option is $1.6 million, which is for upgrading the pumping station and doing some upgrades to the system and setting up a new spray field. Next slide, please. Then the next alternative is a combination option of continuing with spray irrigation, but also building a large effluent disposal bed. So the idea is that you could continue to operate the south spray field, eliminate the north field, and run the effluent from the lagoons on a continuous basis through a tile bed for disposal. And that bed would be built on the west field, as shown on this slide. So the advantage of an effluent disposal bed is that the effluent is applied below ground, so there's no aerosols, and there's no potential for runoff, and it's operated year round. So we don't have to store and hope for the weather. This option is expensive because you're doing an effluent disposal bed is not a cheap option because of the existing clay soils. The bed is fully raised. It's built with imported sand. So the estimated cost of this option is 6.2 million, I think. We can, next slide, please. We also did a variation of this alternative where we moved the spray irrigation to the west field, further away from the existing properties, and build the new disposal bed on the south field. The reason for considering that was to try to minimize impacts to adjacent properties. It's an option that would take a little bit longer to implement because you'd have to set up the new spray field on the west before you can build the bed on the south field. But it gives you a little bit of flexibility. The estimated cost of that option is 8.3 million, which and the next slide, please. And the last option that we considered is to eliminate spray irrigation altogether and replace it entirely with a larger effluent disposal bed that would take all of the effluent. So the bed would have the required capacity. It would be built, I suppose, in a number of cells, so in somewhat modular manner, I suppose, and it would fully eliminate the main concerns of runoff and of impacts to adjacent properties, and eliminate the concern about the weather, right? So that would take that risk out of the equation. And as an effluent disposal bed, just like a tile bed doesn't last forever, it would be built such that there would be spare land provided for replacing it in the future. The estimated cost of this option is 7.3 million. Next slide, please. So we've reviewed these alternatives. We've estimated their annual operating costs. We considered their cost over 20 years. We've considered all the input that we've received to date from people that are the most directly affected. And so in theory, we could, based on desktop numbers, continue with spray irrigation only. But we'd have to keep the north field. And it is the lowest cost option. But there still remains the risk that it will not do the job. And that they would still have to, at times, haul effluent to the Lagoon City sewage treatment plant. Considering the combo alternatives, if I call them, where we keep some spray irrigation and we have a tile bed to assist. So that would definitely reduce the risks of runoff and reduce the risk associated with the weather patterns changing. But it requires the township to operate two types of systems. So the annual operating costs would be higher than they have been to date. And I mean, there are some advantages because you could set up a spray field and then over time decommission that and expand the tile bed. But that's somewhat of a minor advantage in our opinion. Or we, like I said, we abandon spray irrigation, build a larger bed. The initial costs are high, but the annual operating costs are much less than what that it's been for spray irrigation. And it eliminates all of the current concerns with the existing systems. So next slide, please. So for those reasons, and considering the history of the system, the study team's preliminary preferred solution is to abandon effluent spray irrigation and to replace it with a subsurface disposal approach with a large raised bed on the west field. So what it would involve in terms of infrastructure would be, there would be a new pumping station to pump the effluent from the lagoons to the bed and to distribute it evenly throughout the cells of this large bed. And at the low application rate, which would be appropriate for the soils under it, so that you know, it would be designed very conservatively at a very low rate, because no matter what, we're still dealing with silty and clay soils below. So the effluent has to be spread over a large area at a low rate. I mean, it's the same concept. The lagoons stay because they're the one who provide the pre-treatment to the sewage before the bed. The study team also recommends that the township continue their to monitor potential sources of inflow and infiltration into the Bayshore Village sewer systems, and continue to have annual budgets and programs to continue to do repairs to the sewers and the connection as needed, so that stay on top of that. It's really important to do so. So that would be a recommendation of the report. Next slide. So what happens next is that now we collect comments from you and other stakeholders and factor them in the evaluation. We'll respond to all the questions and requests for comments that we receive. And there's a couple studies that need to get done still. There's going to be an archaeological investigation of the West Field in June. And there's going to be a bit more geotechnical work that's going to be done on the West Field. And then we do a final evaluation. We prepare a draft report that's going to be submitted to the township and to the Ministry of the Environment. And so once we receive their comments and address them, we'll finalize the Class CA report, and then it'll go back to the public for a 30-day review period. So that should occur this summer, by the end of this summer. In the fall of 2024, that's when the design of the preferred solution would start and an application made to the Ministry of the Environment for approval. Ministry's review takes a year. So construction of any of the solution would be in 2026. So we're talking, 3 more years, essentially. So next slide. So in the interim, the township will need to continue with the existing spray irrigation system. But the township is committed to operating the spray irrigation system in strict compliance with the certificate of approval and to direct their operators to supervise their operation as required by the Ministry of the Environment and to do whatever repairs and adjustments are necessary. And township will also continue to work on Bayshore Village sewers. And if needed, they will implement their contingency plan, which is to haul effluent to the Lagoon City sewage treatment plant. We don't see any other way around this until something else is built. So as Diana said, we'd like your comments in writing. There's a comment sheet in the back, or send me an email. The address is on the comment sheet. It's also in the notice. I think it's on the website. But just to keep things moving, we'd like those comments in the next 2 weeks by June 7th. This presentation is going to be available on the township website. So we really would appreciate your comments.